Hello, everyone. Tonight, we begin with something a little darker. A journey into the heart of human misery. A time when existence itself was called into question. Forget the romantic stories of knights and ladies, the fantasies of shining kingdoms. That's the fairy tale version history sells us. The truth is, for the average person in medieval Europe, life was less about joy and more about a constant struggle against daily brutality. And what's worse, the brutality of something you couldn't even see. It wasn't just a disease. It was an event that rewrote the rules of society, of power, of survival itself. Tonight, you are not a heroic crusader or a majestic king. You are just you, thrown unprepared into a world where the very air could be a death sentence. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from all over the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum. And let's delve into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just woken up in the year 1340, somewhere in the vast expanse of Eurasia. Though you don't know it, the sun filters through the cracks of your humble dwelling, and the sounds of medieval life, which are anything but subtle, assault you. You hear the bleating of sheep, the clucking of hens, the shouting of children playing in the dirt street, and the smell. Ah, the smell. An unmistakable mix of manure, wood smoke, human sweat, and yes, a persistent aftertaste of freely flowing silage wherever. This is your world, a world where hygiene as we know it is a distant fantasy, where disease is a constant companion, and where life, even at its best, is an exercise in precariousness. Before the shadow of the Black Death covered the continent, life was already a macabre lottery. Life expectancy was laughable. Endemic diseases like dysentery, tuberculosis, and smallpox claimed lives with relentless regularity. Malnutrition was common, sanitation non-existent, and medical knowledge rudimentary at best. Cities were hotbeds of infection, with their narrow alleys and crowded populations, while the countryside, though more dispersed, offer no real protection against the inevitability of disease. People lived with death as a neighbor, always lurking, always ready to claim its next victim. There were no modern hospitals, no antibiotics, not even a basic understanding of germs. Disease was attributed to bad air, humoral imbalances, or, most commonly, divine punishment. Against this backdrop of chronic vulnerability, the perfect storm was brewing, one that would test the limits of human endurance like never before. Medieval normalcy was a daily dance with mortality, and the Black Death was about to turn that dance into a frantic waltz of destruction. Tonight's star, if one can call it that, is a small bacterium with a name that inspires fear, Yersinia pestis. It's not just a bacterium, it's a microscopic force of nature, a silent architect of the apocalypse. Originating in rodent burrows on the steppes of Central Asia, Yersinia pestis does not specifically seek to kill humans. Its preferred hosts are rats and other small mammals, where it causes cyclical outbreaks, lying dormant for decades only to resurface with renewed ferocity. The bacterium has several forms of manifestation, but the most notable and lethal for humans are three: bubonic plague, pneumonic plague, and septicemic plague. Bubonic, the most common, is characterized by buboes, those grotesquely inflamed and painful lymph nodes that give the disease its name. Pneumonic, the most feared, attacks the lungs, allowing person-to-person transmission through the air, an unstoppable killing machine in enclosed environments. And septicemic, the rarest and most fulminant, directly invading the bloodstream, leading to rapid death without bubo formation. The biology of Yersinia pestis is a masterpiece of parasitic adaptation. It reproduces rapidly, evades the host's immune system, and, crucially for its spread, creates a blockage in the stomach of its main vector, the flea, forcing it to bite repeatedly in an attempt to feed, thus regurgitating the bacteria into the bite wound. Understanding its mechanism is to understand why it was so devastating. It was not a simple fever. It was a microscopic invader designed to sow chaos, and in the human body, it found fertile ground for its destructive fury. Modern science has given us the tools to unravel its secrets, but in the 14th century, it was simply an inexplicable and divine fury. The dynamic duo of the bubonic plague, and perhaps the most infamous of its collaborators, were the black rat, Rattus rattus, and its indispensable passenger, the oriental rat flea, Xenopsila chiopus. Imagine a medieval ship, or a cart, or a trade caravan. Don't think of a pristine environment. Think of a moving nest of dirt, waste, and of course, rats. Heaps of them. The black rat, smaller and more agile than its cousin the brown rat, was the perfect companion for medieval human life. They loved buildings, houses, barns. In short, any place where there was food and shelter. They lived in astonishing proximity to humans, often sharing the same structures and sometimes even the same beds, however repugnant that may sound. And on these rats, clinging to their fur, lived the fleas, hundreds of them. When a rat died of bubonic plague, its fleas, hungry and thirsty for blood, abandoned the cold body of their host to seek a new one. And often, that new host was a human. A single bite was enough. The flea, with its stomach blocked by bacteria, injected Yersinia pestis directly into the bloodstream of the unsuspecting human. The scale of their presence was overwhelming. It wasn't one or two rats, but massive populations living in every city, every town, every house, an invisible army of small rodents carrying their invisible and lethal passengers. The symbiotic relationship between the rat and the flea was the engine that would drive the plague across entire continents. Without these two messengers of death, the bubonic plague would not have been the global catastrophe we know. Their omnipresence, their capacity for proliferation, and their intimate connection with the medieval daily life made them the perfect silent architects of annihilation. The concept of hygiene in the Middle Ages is, at best, a euphemism. At worst, a macabre joke. Medieval cities, despite being centers of culture and commerce, were also open-air sewers. Streets were public latrines, garbage dumps, and children's playgrounds, all in one. Human and animal waste accumulated unchecked. Slaughterhouses often operated within city limits, dumping blood and entrails directly into the streets, or into rivers that also served as sources of drinking water. Houses were small, dark, poorly ventilated, and often shared with domestic animals. Beds were perfect nests for parasites and rodents. People rarely bathed, clothes were infrequently washed, and pest control was a completely alien idea. It's not that they were ignorant by choice. They simply lacked fundamental knowledge about disease transmission. They believed in the miasma theory, that diseases were caused by bad air or putrid vapors, which, although wrong, at least sometimes led to attempts to ventilate spaces or burn aromatic herbs. But these measures were a drop in an ocean of unsanitary conditions. The population density in cities, the lack of sewage systems, the reliance on contaminated water sources, and the intimate coexistence with rodents and insects created an ideal breeding ground for any infectious disease, and much more so for one as virulent as the plague. It was an environment where disease could not only thrive, but was almost inevitable. A simple walk down a medieval street could be an exposure to countless pathogens, and the Black Death found in these conditions a formidable ally for its unprecedented expansion. The Silk Road, that vast network of trade routes connecting east and west, was much more than a simple conduit for spices, silks, and porcelain. It was also an invisible highway for the exchange of pathogens. The Black Death did not appear out of nowhere in Europe. Its journey was methodical, following the well-worn paths of trade. Originating somewhere on the plains of Central Asia, possibly in the marnot rodent environment of the Tian Shan or the Himalayan regions, the bacterium traveled via merchant caravans and soldiers. As goods moved from east to west, so did rats and their fleas, hidden in shipments of wool, grain, or fabrics. The concept of quarantine was unknown, and health inspections were unthinkable. Every stop at an oasis, every market in a city, every camp along the route became a potential spreading point. The disease spread through China, decimating massive populations before crossing the Urals. Then it moved along the Black Sea, reaching port cities controlled by Genoese and Venetian merchants. These routes were not just lines on a map. They were networks of human and animal interaction that facilitated the plague's jump from one population to another. The Black Death exploited the incipient globalization of the Middle Ages, demonstrating that in a connected world, a local calamity could quickly become a global catastrophe. The same human ingenuity that built these trade routes for prosperity unknowingly opened the way for history's deadliest disease. In the vast and often bloody chessboard of the Eurasian steppes, the Kipchak Khanate, a faction of the Golden Horde, played a crucial role in the initial spread of the Black Death to Europe. Imagine a declining but still formidable Mongol empire whose military and commercial ambitions led them to interact with the Western world. The plague had already devastated parts of China and Central Asia, territories under Mongol influence or control. When the disease struck the Kipchak Khanate's armies, the nomads did not understand what was happening to them. Their camps were mobile, but conditions were ideal for spread. People and animals in close proximity. Rudimentary sanitation. The plague spread among their ranks, decimating their warriors and affecting their military capacity. However, instead of retreating completely, they used the disease, perhaps without fully understanding its nature, as a weapon. It was during the siege of the trading city of Kaffa, a Genoese colony on the Crimean Peninsula, that this interaction between war and disease reached its climax. The Mongols, led by Janibek Khan, had besieged Kaffa for some time, but their own troops were being decimated by the mysterious and fulminant disease. Desperation or cunning led to a macabre decision that would change the course of history. And so we come to the exact moment when the Black Death, until then an Asian calamity, made its way into Europe. The siege of Kaffa in 1346. Imagine this port city, a Genoese commercial jewel on the Crimean coast, surrounded by the forces of the Kipchak Khanate. The situation was already tense. The Genoese, a mercantile and stubborn people, refused to yield. But within the lines of the Mongol besiegers, something terrible was happening. Janibek Khan's soldiers were dying en masse, not from Genoese weapons, but from a mysterious and fulminant disease. The Mongol camps were becoming makeshift cemeteries, and troop morale was crumbling. In an act that has gone down in history as the first recorded use of biological warfare, Janibek Khan, or his commanders, made the brutal decision to catapult the putrefying bodies of their own plague-dead soldiers over Kaffa's walls. We don't know if they did it with a scientific understanding of transmission or simply from a desire to spread despair and terror. But the effect was devastating. The bodies crashed onto the city streets, scattering miasmas and, more importantly, infected fleas that quickly found new hosts among the besieged population. The plague, which until then had been contained outside the walls, was now unleashed within the city. Panic seized Kaffa. The inhabitants, already weakened by the siege and terrified by this new and horrific death coming from the heavens, watched as the disease spread unchecked. Kaffa could not resist, but to the internal devastation of the plague, the Genoese and Venetian merchants who had sought refuge within its walls made a desperate decision: to flee. Imagine the ships, packed to the brim with terrified refugees, setting sail from Kaffa's port, leaving behind a city in agony. They did not know that they were not fleeing the plague, but carrying it with them. These sailors and merchants, with their goods, and crucially, their unwanted passengers, infected rats and fleas, headed west, towards the vibrant Mediterranean ports that were the heart of commercial Europe. Genoa and Venice, the two great maritime powers of the time, were the natural destinations for these ships. They were bustling centers of trade, with dense populations, warehouses crammed with goods, and, of course, a massive population of rats. Conditions were ideal for the plague to take root. Upon arrival in port, sick or dying sailors disembarked, and with them, or more precisely, inside their cargo, came infected rats and their deadly fleas. There was no quarantine. The idea of isolating sick ships and people was practically non-existent. The contagion was instantaneous and brutal. The ports became the entry points, the beachheads of a silent and devastating invasion. The Italian city-states, with their rich trade networks, would quickly become the epicenter of the European plague, radiating death throughout the continent. Genoa and Venice, symbols of prosperity and mercantile power, were transformed into the unwitting gates of the apocalypse. The initial spread of the Black Death across the Mediterranean was astonishingly rapid and brutal, a testament to the efficiency of maritime routes and the density of coastal populations. After the landing in Kaffa and the flight of the Genoese ships, it did not take long for the disease to reach European soil. Sicily was one of the first points of impact. It is said that ships arrived at the port of Messina in October 1347, carrying sailors who were already sick or dying. The people of the port watched in horror as men dropped dead on the docks, their bodies covered in horrific black buboes. Panic seized the city, and despite desperate attempts to drive the ships away, it was too late. The plague had already taken root. From Sicily, it spread rapidly to the Italian peninsula. Pisa, an important port, was one of the next to fall, closely followed by Genoa and Venice, the departure points of the infected ships. The disease respected no limits or borders. Ships sailing from infected Italian ports carried the plague to Marseille, in southern France, in January 1348. From there, the plague dispersed through the Rhone Valley, reaching cities like Avignon, then the seat of the papacy, a convergence point for clerics and pilgrims from all over Europe. The speed with which the plague moved from one port to another and then inland was terrifying. Each new infected city became a new center of spread, in turn sending travelers and goods, and with them invisible death, to new destinations. The Mediterranean, once an artery of life and commerce, had become a channel of death. In a world without the microscope, without an understanding of bacteria or viruses, medieval medicine was a mixture of limited empirical observation, ancient philosophy, and above all, a large dose of superstition and resignation. When the Black Death began to spread, doctors, if they could even be called that, faced a completely incomprehensible enemy. Their tools were useless, their theories wrong, and their helplessness absolute. One main medical theory was that of miasmas, the idea that disease was caused by bad air or putrid vapors. This led to treatments such as burning aromatic herbs, ventilating houses, and using amulets to purify the air. There was also a strong belief in the humors. theory of Hippocrates and Galen, which posited that the human body was composed of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease was seen as an imbalance of these humors, and treatments often involved bloodletting, purges, and emetics to restore balance. Imagine someone suffering from the plague, with high fever and suppurating buboes, and a doctor applying leeches or making an incision to bleed the patient. These treatments, at best, were ineffective, and at worst, hastened death by further weakening the patient. The lack of hygiene in medical practice was appalling. Instruments were not sterilized, and doctors often contracted the disease themselves. Desperation led to even stranger and more desperate remedies, from consuming arsenic to applying excrement to buboes. Medical ignorance not only meant they could not cure the plague, it meant they often made the situation worse, both for patients and for public health in general. It was a heroic, but largely futile struggle against an enemy whose name and nature were completely unknown. The landing of the Black Death in Sicily in October 1347 marked the point of no return for Europe. The Mediterranean island became the plague's first major gateway to the European continent. It is said that a merchant ship coming from the Black Sea or from already infected ports arrived at the port of Messina. It was not just any ship. It was a ghost ship, in a way, crewed by dying sailors, some already corpses, with horrible black buboes festering on their bodies. Horror and confusion seized the inhabitants of Messina. The authorities tried desperately but futilely to drive the ship out of the port, but the damage was already done. The disease had infiltrated. It wasn't long before the inhabitants of Messina began to fall ill with the same horrifying symptoms: high fever, delirium, the appearance of buboes, and rapid, inevitable death. Bodies piled up in the streets faster than they could be buried, and panic spread like wildfire. Those who could fled the city, seeking refuge in the countryside or in other cities in Sicily, carrying the disease with them. The Black Death was not a simple epidemic. It was a silent annihilation, moving at a terrifying speed. People died so quickly that there was no time for proper funeral rituals, not even for mourning. Sicily, a lush and vital island, was transformed into a vast cemetery. Its fate was a harbinger of what was to come for the rest of Europe, a macabre preview of the devastation ahead, with every port and every city becoming a new station on the journey of death. From Sicily, the Black Death spread relentlessly across the Italian peninsula, transforming the vibrant heart of medieval civilization into an epicenter of death. Pisa, with its important port and commercial connections, was one of the first major cities to fall after Sicily, around January 1348. From there, the plague advanced north. Genoa and Venice, the two maritime superpowers that had been the initial entry points, were devastated by the very disease their ships had carried. Their dense populations, narrow streets, and constant commercial bustle made them perfect breeding grounds for Yersinia pestis. In Florence, the jewel of the incipient Renaissance, the plague reached its zenith between the spring and summer of 1348, carrying away 2/3 of its population, according to some estimates. The famous writer Giovanni Boccaccio, in his Decameron, offers a vivid and heartbreaking account of the city's desolation, with corpses piled in the streets and the dissolution of all social norms. People fled the cities to the countryside, only to carry the plague with them. Those who stayed barricaded themselves in their homes or indulged in wild revelry, believing the end was near. The impact on Italy was catastrophic. Cities, once bustling and prosperous, were emptied. Families were extinguished. Economic life was paralyzed. The Black Death not only decimated the population, It destroyed the social structure and faith in a divine order, leaving an indelible scar on the soul of the peninsula. Italy was, in many ways, the testing ground for the devastation the plague could inflict. Even the eternal city, Rome, and the spiritual heart of Christendom, the Vatican, were not immune to the scourge of the Black Death. The plague reached Rome in the spring of 1348, radiating from the port cities of southern Italy. Imagine the capital of a fallen empire, yet still a center of pilgrimage and faith, with its packed churches and densely populated neighborhoods. The disease spread with the same ferocity as in other cities. Testimonies speak of streets full of corpses, of priests dying before they could administer the last rites, and of widespread despair. The death toll was astonishing, though exact figures are difficult to determine. It is estimated that at least a third of Rome's population perished. Within the Vatican, although the papal curia resided in Avignon, France at the time, the plague also ravaged the clerical population and the community. Entire monasteries were emptied, and the church's infrastructure, already under political strain, was severely weakened by the loss of personnel. Clerical mortality was particularly high, as priests, monks, and nuns had an obligation to attend to the dying and confess the sick, directly exposing themselves to contagion. The sight of the Black Death ravaging Rome, with its millennia of history and its symbolism as the center of Christendom, was a devastating blow to morale. If not even the city of the apostles was safe, what hope was there for the rest of the world? The sacredness of the city offered no protection against the bacterium's indifference, highlighting humanity's vulnerability, even in its most sacred places. From Italy, the Black Death crossed the Alps and entered France, spreading like an ink stain on parchment. Marseille, on the Mediterranean coast, was the first major French port to be hit in early 1348. From there, the plague ascended the Rhone Valley, an important river and trade route. Its inevitable destination was Avignon, the city that at the time was not only a French city, but the nerve center of papal power, the home of the Curia. It was a place of immense human traffic: cardinals, bishops, pilgrims, diplomats, merchants from all over Europe. The arrival of the plague in Avignon was an event of cataclysmic proportions. The city's population was decimated, and Pope Clement VI himself was forced to take desperate measures, secluding himself in his chambers, lighting fires to purify the air, following the miasma theory, and allowing thousands of bodies to be thrown into the Rhone River, as cemeteries were overflowing. It is estimated that a third of the cardinals and half of the priests in Avignon died. Panic spread throughout France, and the plague continued its inexorable march north and west. Large cities like Paris also suffered massive losses, with their hospitals and cemeteries collapsing. The social dissolution that had begun in Italy was replicated in France, with the flight of the population, the abandonment of fields, and the collapse of authority structures. The Black Death was not only killing people, it was dismantling medieval society piece by piece, demonstrating that neither piety nor power nor wealth could stop its advance. While the plague devastated France, it crossed the Pyrenees and entered the Iberian Peninsula, striking Aragon, Castile, and the remaining kingdoms at a time of complex political dynamics. The Reconquista, that long and bloody struggle between Christians and Muslims, was abruptly interrupted by an invisible enemy that did not distinguish between creeds or flags. Barcelona, Valencia, and Seville, important commercial and port centers, were among the first to feel the impact of the plague, which arrived from the Mediterranean maritime routes. Entire cities saw their populations drastically reduced. Chronicles speak of empty convents and ghost towns. Kings and nobles were not exempt. Alfonso XI of Castile, for example, is one of the few reigning monarchs in Europe who died of the Black Death in 1350 while besieging Gibraltar. His death was a devastating blow to the kingdom's stability and a clear reminder that the disease respected no hierarchy. In Aragon, King Peter IV was forced to flee his palaces as the plague approached. The logistics of war, administration, and trade were severely affected. Labor became scarce, agriculture suffered, and the already fragile feudal structures tottered. Social tensions sharpened, and desperation led many to seek solace in religion or indulge in hedonism. The Iberian Peninsula, with its multiple kingdoms and intense commercial and military activity, offered the plague an easy path for its spread, leaving behind a legacy of death and disruption that would take centuries to heal. The Reconquista had to wait, while life itself struggled to reconquer a minimum of normalcy. The Black Death soon crossed the English Channel, reaching England in the summer of 1348. It is believed that the first documented cases occurred in the port of Melcombe Regis, Dorset, towards the end of June. A merchant ship, possibly from Bordeaux, English territory in France, already affected by the plague, brought death with it. From Dorset, the disease followed trade routes and main roads inland. The speed with which it spread was alarming. Contemporary accounts speak of entire villages emptying, of uncultivated fields, and of a sense of dread spreading through the countryside. The plague made no distinctions. It struck the rich and the poor, the clergy and the peasants. King Edward III tried to take measures, but his understanding of the disease was nil. Monastic chronicles, often the only written sources of the time, document the devastation in chilling detail, recording the death of abbots, monks, and lay people on an unprecedented scale. The lack of sanitation and the population density in English cities, as on the continent, created a perfect breeding ground for the rapid spread of Yersinia pestis. The initial impact was a paralyzing shock, a direct blow to the heart of English society, which was already entangled in the 100 Years' War. The arrival of the plague in England was not just a medical event. It was a demographic and social cataclysm that would redefine the nation's future, laying the groundwork for profound changes in the economy, social structure, and the relationship between lord and peasant. When the Black Death reached London in the autumn of 1348, the metropolis, already one of Europe's largest and busiest cities, became a hell. Imagine the narrow cobblestone streets, the densely packed wooden buildings, human and animal waste thrown directly from windows onto the public thoroughfare. The Thames docks, teeming with ships and goods, were perfect access points for rats and their fleas. The city, with an estimated population of 50,000 to 80,000 inhabitants, quickly succumbed. The first cases appeared in the port districts, and the disease spread with vertiginous speed through markets, workshops, and homes. Mortality was appalling. It is estimated that between a third and half of London's population perished in a short period. Church bells tolled constantly to announce deaths, until the bell ringers themselves fell. Cemeteries filled so rapidly that new mass graves had to be created on the outskirts of the city, such as the famous East Smithfield, where thousands of corpses were buried in layers. Panic was palpable. The few remaining doctors were ineffective. The church, overwhelmed by the number of dying and the death of its own clerics, could barely offer spiritual comfort. Parliament dissolved, courts closed, and the city's commercial and social life ground to a halt. London was not just besieged by the plague, it was conquered. The smoke from funeral pyres mixed with the sweet, nauseating stench of decomposition, creating an apocalyptic atmosphere. The city that had been the heart of the kingdom became a monument to the fragility of human life. From England, the Black Death continued its relentless march north, crossing borders and inland seas to reach Scotland and Ireland. The spread to Scotland was a particular case of tragic irony. When the plague was already decimating England, the Scots, in the midst of their prolonged enmity with the English, saw their neighbors' calamity as an opportunity. Mustering their armies for an invasion on the border, they hoped to take advantage of English weakness. However, what they found in their foray was not easy spoils, but invisible death. The Scottish army, camped in unsanitary conditions and in contact with the air and goods of an infected England, was soon struck by the plague. The disease spread rapidly through their ranks, forcing them into a chaotic retreat and carrying the plague back to Scotland. Scottish chronicles describe the devastation with horror, with the disease sweeping the country. In Ireland, the arrival of the plague was equally brutal. Geographically isolated, but connected by maritime and trade routes with England and the continent, the island could not escape. The disease spread through port cities and then inland, decimating the population. Irish monks recorded the plague's ferocity in their annals, noting the death of numerous clerics and laypeople. The Black Death not only ravaged human lives, it also deepened existing divisions and exacerbated social and political tensions in these regions, leaving a trail of death and disruption that would take generations to heal. The irony of fate struck Scotland hard as it sought war and found the plague. As the Black Death swept through Western Europe, its relentless advance continued eastward and northward, reaching Germany and the Low Countries with similar ferocity. The Hanseatic cities, those powerful leagues of merchant cities that dominated trade in the North Sea and the Baltic, became the next victims. Hamburg, Bremen, Lübeck, and other commercial centers, with their dense populations and bustling ports, were ideal entry points for the plague. Ships carrying goods and travelers from England and the Low Countries brought death with them. The Black Death respected neither walls nor wealth. Mortality rates in these cities were devastating, with thousands of people dying within months. In many regions of Germany, despair led to the persecution of minorities, especially Jews, who were accused of poisoning wells to spread the disease, which led to horrific pogroms. The Low Countries, with their intricate network of waterways and dense population in cities like Ghent, Bruges, and Antwerp, also suffered greatly. Contemporary chronicles describe deserted streets, unharvested fields, and the dissolution of social order. The plague severely disrupted trade and the economy of the region, which depended heavily on its maritime and river links. Unlike Italy or France, the Black Death in Germany and the Low Countries was often exacerbated by political fragmentation and the lack of a strong centralized authority to coordinate a response. The impact was so profound that the demographic and social scars would take centuries to heal, redefining the human and economic landscape of these important European regions. When the Black Death spread across Europe, it did so under a veil of terror and despair that few generations have experienced. Imagine living in a world where death is not a distant possibility, but an imminent certainty, which could appear at any moment, anywhere. The fear was not just of death, but of the way it presented itself, with grotesque buboes, delirious fever, vomiting, and rapid agony. But the terror went beyond physical symptoms. It was social panic. People fled their homes, abandoned their families, left the sick to die alone for fear of contagion. Family and community ties broke down. Friends refused to see each other. Husbands abandoned their wives, children their parents. People locked themselves in their homes. But that offered no real protection. The few who ventured outside saw streets full of corpses, carts of the dead, and the sweet, sickly smell of decay. Nauseating stench of decomposition. There was no explanation, no cure. Prayers seemed ineffective. Doctors fled or died. Desperation drove people to extremes. Some indulged in orgies of hedonism, believing the end of the world was imminent. Others turned to religious fanaticism, flagellating themselves in public to appease divine wrath. The atmosphere was charged with paranoia. Foreigners, Jews, the poor, all were possible scapegoats. The veil of terror was not just a metaphor. It was a palpable reality that choked hope, destroyed morale, and revealed the fragility of human civilization when confronted with an invisible and incomprehensible enemy. The scale of mortality during the Black Death remains a subject of debate among historians, but estimates of the death toll are chilling. Imagine that 1 out of 3, or even 1 out of 2, of your friends, family, and neighbors disappear in a matter of months or years. That is what happened in Europe between 1347 and 1351. The most conservative estimates suggest that at least a third of the European population perished, which amounts to about 25 million people out of a total population of 75 to 100 million. Other estimates, based on the archaeology of mass graves and the analysis of parish and cadastral records, raise the figure to 50%, and in some places up to 60% or even more. Entire cities like Florence or Siena lost between half and 2/3 of their inhabitants. Entire villages and towns were deserted, with their houses in ruins and their fields uncultivated. The speed of death was as terrifying as its omnipresence. People died within days of the onset of the first symptoms. Mortality rates varied by region, population density, and sanitary conditions, but no part of Europe escaped unscathed. The plague did not distinguish between rich and poor, young and old, although the most vulnerable were usually the first to fall. To contextualize, the Black Death killed a percentage of the population that would not be equaled by any other calamity in Western history until the world wars of the 20th century. And even then, the density of death in such a short time was unmatched. It was a demographic blow from which Europe would take centuries to recover, redefining the relationship between land, labor, and capital in ways unimaginable before the plague. Faced with the relentless advance of the Black Death, medieval medicine was, in essence, a medicine of desperation. Its methods were rudimentary, its theories mistaken, and its healing capacity nil. Bloodletting was one of the most common and dangerous practices. Based on the theory of the four humors, it was believed that by extracting blood, one could eliminate the excess of bad humors that were thought to cause the disease. Imagine a patient already weakened by fever and plague who was subjected to an incision or had leeches applied, further draining their already compromised body. This not only weakened the patient, but also increased the risk of secondary infection. Another common method was purging, administering laxatives or emetics to cleanse the body of toxins. Local treatments for buboes, those inflamed and painful lymph nodes that gave the disease its name, were equally ineffective and often painful. Poultices of herbs, animal excrement, or even hot irons were applied to cauterize them, with the belief that poison was being expelled. Amulets and talismans were also ubiquitous. It was believed that wearing certain gems, herbs, or even religious texts could repel the disease. Some doctors recommended smelling flowers or aromatic herbs to counteract bad airs. Medieval medicine lacked an understanding of asepsis, so doctors themselves, when handling the sick, became vectors of contagion. It was a heroic but blind struggle against an enemy beyond their comprehension. A painful display of human helplessness in the face of nature's fury. The plague doctors are one of the most iconic and at the same time most mysterious images of the Black Death. However, their origin and distinctive attire are actually from centuries later, not from the time of the Great Plague of 1347 to 1351. The image we have of them, with their bird beak masks, hats, and long waxed coats, is a 17th century invention. At the time of the Black Death, there was no formal profession of plague doctor as we know it today. The few existing doctors, often barber surgeons or healers, simply faced the disease as best they could. Most of them fled or fell victim to the plague. Those who stayed did so out of a sense of duty, faith, or the promise of large sums of money from desperate municipal authorities. Their methods were those we have already described: bloodletting, purges, and poultices, all ineffective. There were no protective uniforms, no masks, no gloves. They protected themselves with prayers, with the burning of incense or aromatic herbs, or simply with resignation. The figure of the plague doctor with his bird's beak, which was filled with aromatic herbs to filter bad airs, was devised by Charles de Lorme in 1619, during later plague outbreaks. Its purpose was to protect the doctor from miasmas, not from germs that were unknown. But the idea of these shadowy individuals, wandering through streets full of dead, has merged in our imagination with the first and most devastating pandemic. It is a powerful symbol of desperation, helplessness, and the solitary struggle against an invisible force that defies all medical logic. When death arrived on such an incomprehensible scale, people clung to the most powerful explanation they had: religion. The Black Death was not seen as a natural disease, but as a divine punishment, a manifestation of God's wrath for humanity's sins. This belief led to an explosion of religious fervor, but also to extreme forms of fanaticism and desperation. One of the most notorious movements was that of the flagellants. Imagine processions of men, sometimes hundreds or thousands, dressed in robes and hoods, marching from town to town. At each stop, they would halt in the public square and, to the sound of chants and prayers, strip off their shirts to brutally flagellate themselves with leather whips tipped with iron until their backs bled. They believed that by suffering and atoning for their own sins and those of humanity, they could appease God's wrath and make the plague recede. These movements, although sometimes garnering great popular support, were viewed with suspicion by the Church, which considered them heretical and destabilizing. Pope Clement VI condemned them in the year 1349. Beyond the flagellants, faith was tested in countless ways. Some retreated into prayer and penitence. Others sought solace in miracles or relics. But many, seeing the pious and the sinners die alike, lost faith completely, plunging into hedonism or nihilism. The Black Death was a spiritual cataclysm, leaving a deep mark on Europe's religious psyche, sowing the seeds of doubts and challenges to ecclesiastical authority that centuries later would contribute to the Protestant Reformation. Amidst the panic and desperate search for scapegoats during the Black Death, one of the darkest and most shameful tragedies of the era was the Jewish pogroms. As the plague spread, and with the absence of a scientific explanation for its origin or spread, people sought culprits. Jewish communities, already objects of prejudice and discrimination in medieval Europe, became the primary target of these baseless accusations. They were accused of poisoning wells, deliberately spreading the disease to exterminate Christians, and conspiring with demonic forces. These accusations, often fueled by collective hysteria and the preaching of some fanatical clerics, led to a series of brutal massacres throughout Europe, especially in Germany and the Rhine Basin. Cities like Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne witnessed horrific acts of violence. Entire Jewish communities were annihilated. Imagine hundreds or thousands of people forced from their homes, tortured to confess crimes they did not commit, and then burned alive on massive pyres. Despite Pope Clement VI issuing papal bulls condemning the persecution of Jews and affirming their innocence, his authority was often ignored amidst the hysteria. Some nobles and cities tried to protect their Jewish communities, but popular pressure and fear were too great. The irony was cruel. Jewish communities, with their strict dietary laws and hygiene practices, such as hand washing and regular cleaning, often had slightly lower mortality rates in some places, which, instead of dispelling the accusations, only fueled them further. The Jewish pogroms were not a direct consequence of the plague, but a brutal manifestation of ignorance, fanaticism, and pre-existing hatred, exacerbated by apocalyptic terror. The Church, the most powerful and omnipresent institution of the Middle Ages, was not immune to the devastating blow of the Black Death. In fact, it suffered a profound and multifaceted crisis that would change its structure and its relationship with the faithful forever. Firstly, clerical mortality was astonishingly high. Priests, monks, and nuns had the duty to attend to the dying, administer last rites, and perform burials. This directly exposed them to contagion. Entire parishes were left without clerics, monasteries were emptied, and bishops died at an alarming rate. Imagine a village where suddenly there is no one to baptize, marry, or bury. The church's infrastructure crumbled in many places. To replace the lost clerics, the church was forced to ordain less educated men with little theological training, which led to a decline in the quality of the clergy and an increase in corruption and immoral behavior. Beyond the physical loss, there was a deep crisis of faith. If God was punishing humanity, why did the most pious die along with the sinners? Why were prayers not heard? The church's inability to stop the plague, or even to offer a satisfactory explanation, undermined its moral and spiritual authority. Although some clung to faith more strongly, many others felt abandoned or betrayed. This crisis of legitimacy and the dissolution of traditional ecclesiastical structures sowed the seeds of future reform movements. The Black Death did not overthrow the church, but it shook it to its foundations, exposing its vulnerabilities and forcing it into a painful reevaluation of its role in a post-plague world. Given the relentless march of the Black Death, the survival instinct of many led to a massive flight from cities to the countryside. Imagine the terror. Streets filled with corpses, the omnipresent stench, church bells tolling incessantly. Those who had the means, and sometimes those who didn't, packed what they could and fled the densely populated cities, believing that the pure country air or the isolation of a remote estate would offer them protection. However, this massive flight often proved to be a counterproductive strategy. The refugees, unknowingly, carried the disease with them. Rats and fleas, hidden in their luggage or on their bodies, traveled with them, spreading the plague to villages and rural communities that might otherwise have remained relatively isolated. The countryside, although less dense, also succumbed to the plague, though sometimes with a delay and slightly lower mortality. This chaotic migration also had immediate social and economic consequences. Cities emptied, markets closed, and artisanal production halted. The countryside, on the other hand, found itself with an unexpected influx of people, some of whom were serfs escaping their lords, which destabilized the feudal system. Fields remained uncultivated, crops rotted, and livestock roamed ownerless. The rural exodus was not only a manifestation of panic, but also a catalyst for the spread of the plague and a key factor in the dissolution of the medieval social and economic order. It demonstrated that there was no safe place when death traveled in the air and in the bodies of those who fled. As the Black Death swept across Europe, the scale of death posed an unprecedented logistical problem: how to bury so many dead. Parish cemeteries, which had served for centuries as final resting places, overflowed within weeks. Imagine the horrors of having to pile corpses in the streets, on church porches, or simply leave them where they fell. For lack of hands to move them and places to bury them, human dignity crumbled before the magnitude of the tragedy. The solution was mass cemeteries, improvised mass graves on the outskirts of cities, or in newly designated plots of land. In London, for example, several large plague pits were opened, such as East Smithfield and West Smithfield, where thousands of people were buried in layers, often without coffins, wrapped in simple shrouds. Priests, when available and not sick or dead, could barely stammer a few words of prayer over the piles of bodies before they were covered with earth and lime. The job of gravedigger became one of the most dangerous and macabre, often performed by the few survivors or by those who had been forced into it. The stench of death permeated the air. The sight of death carts and open mass graves was a constant reminder of the plague's omnipresence. The need to bury the dead was not only a matter of respect for the deceased, but a desperate measure to prevent the spread of disease. Although, at the time, it was believed to be due to the miasmas from decomposing bodies. These mass cemeteries are today valuable archaeological sources for historians and epidemiologists, a silent and heartbreaking testament to the scale of the catastrophe. The Black Death not only decimated the population, it also paralyzed the medieval economy, leaving a trail of disruption that would take decades, if not centuries, to repair. Imagine the collapse of the labor force. With the death of between a third and half of the population, fields remained uncultivated, crops rotted on the vines, and artisanal workshops were left without masters or apprentices. The scarcity of workers became palpable in all sectors, from agriculture to construction and trade. Markets, which were the heart of economic life, closed. Long-distance trade came to an abrupt halt. As ships had no crews, ports were paralyzed by disease, and fear of contagion was omnipresent. The production of consumer goods plummeted, leading to widespread shortages and soaring prices. The supply chain broke down. In cities, merchants and bankers closed their businesses. Land leases became impossible to maintain, as there were no people to cultivate them. The feudal system, which depended on a large population of peasants to work the lord's land, faltered. Wealth evaporated for many, while others, through unexpected inheritances from deceased relatives, became rich overnight. Currency devalued, and inflation soared. The medieval economy was not prepared for a shock of this magnitude. It was not a simple recession. It was a systemic collapse that would fundamentally redefine the relationship between capital and labor, and lay the groundwork for economic and social changes that, ironically, would open the way to a new era. The scale of the Black Death catastrophe was so overwhelming that it plunged an entire continent into a state of shock and collective trauma. Imagine not only the death of millions, but the dissolution of the social fabric that sustained them. There was not a family, a community, or an institution that was not touched by the cold hand of the plague. Daily life came to a halt. Church bells, which used to mark village life, tolled constantly for the dead, until the bell ringers themselves fell. Streets, once bustling, became deserted, The countryside, once fertile, was abandoned. People lived with the certainty that their own death could be just around the corner. The capacity for mourning was overwhelmed. There was no time for funeral rituals, nor for individual grief. Social ties broke down due to fear of contagion, with parents abandoning children and neighbors avoiding neighbors. Religious and secular authority was challenged. If God had abandoned humanity, what meaning did faith have? If kings could not protect their subjects, what value did their power have? The Black Death was not just a medical event. It was a psychological cataclysm, a generational trauma that left a deep scar on Europe's psyche. The artistic and literary expressions of the time reflect this shock. The Danse Macabre, Boccaccio's tales, the despair in the chronicles. The continent found itself in a state of shock, an unsettling silence that followed the storm, where survival itself was an achievement and the future a terrifying question. Normalcy, as it was known, had disappeared. The Black Death not only brought death, but also the dissolution of social order and a level of enemy and chaos rarely seen in European history. Imagine a world where laws vanish, where authorities lose their power, and where fear and despair are the only rulers. With the massive death of priests, magistrates, nobles, and administrators, the structure of medieval society crumbled in many places. Courts closed, laws were not enforced, and criminality could increase in the most affected areas. Cities, with their dying inhabitants and streets full of corpses, became scenes of looting and anarchy. People, seeing their loved ones fall and the futility of any attempt to resist the plague, wondered why they should follow the rules. Some indulged in a life of debauchery, believing that the end was near and that there were no consequences for their actions. Others, in their desperation, resorted to violence against those considered scapegoats, such as Jewish communities. A feudal system, which depended on a rigid hierarchy and obedience, faltered as serfs died or fled, and lords lacked the necessary labor to maintain their lands. The lack of proper burials and the accumulation of corpses in the streets was not only a sanitary tragedy, but a collapse of social dignity. Anomie, that sense of normlessness or purposelessness, was palpable. The Black Death not only killed people, it also undermined the foundations of medieval society, leaving a vacuum where chaos and uncertainty reigned, and forcing survivors to rebuild the world from the rubble. Amidst the annihilation of the Black Death, human reaction took extreme forms, and one of the most unsettling was that of feast and death, a kind of extreme carpe diem. Imagine the desperation of knowing that each day could be your last. That death lurked around every corner. For some, this certainty led to unrestrained hedonism. Why work? Why save? Why worry about morals or social conventions if death was about to claim them all? Taverns could be full, even as streets were littered with corpses. People indulged in banquets, drinking, and promiscuity, trying to wring every drop of pleasure from their last hours. Boccaccio, in his Decameron, describes how some Florentines isolated themselves in country villas, attempting to live in an artificial paradise of food, drink, and entertainment, ignoring the horror around them, until the plague reached them too. This attitude was not universal, of course. Many others gave themselves over to prayer and penance, or locked themselves in paralyzing fear. But the existence of this hedonistic response reveals the deep psychological crisis the plague generated. It was a reaction to the overwhelming sense of helplessness. If death could not be controlled, at least how one lived what remained of life could be. It was a macabre mockery of inevitability, a frantic dance on the edge of the abyss, where joy mixed with horror, and life was celebrated with death as a guest of honor. Carpe diem had never been so literal, nor so grim. The impact of the Black Death on medieval culture and society found its most eloquent echo in the literary testimonies of the time. Imagine writers, eyewitnesses to the catastrophe, trying to make sense of a horror that defied all comprehension. Giovanni Boccaccio, with his masterpiece The Decameron, is perhaps the most famous of them. His collection of 100 tales, narrated by 10 young people, 7 women and 3 men, who flee plague-devastated Florence to take refuge in a country villa, is not just a work of fiction. It is a vivid and heartbreaking testimony to the social and moral dissolution that the plague caused. Boccaccio describes the brutality of the disease, the abandonment of the sick, the collapse of social norms, and widespread desperation. Another literary giant of the era, Francesco Petrarch, the father of humanism, also wrote about the plague with deep anguish. He suffered the loss of many close friends, and in a particularly painful way, that of his beloved Laura, who is believed to have died of the plague in Avignon. His letters and poems reflect grief, desolation, and the feeling of a shattered world. He lamented the loss of so many intellectuals and artists, fearing that knowledge and culture would be lost forever. These authors not only recorded the horrors of the plague, they also tried to process the collective trauma. Their works, often written in the vernacular rather than Latin, are not only invaluable historical documents, but also moving expressions of the human experience in the face of an unprecedented calamity. An attempt to give voice to the inexpressible and preserve the memory of a world transformed by death. The Black Death left a deep mark on the art of the time, giving rise to a visual genre that still chills us today, the danse macabre. Imagine artists, with the horrors of the plague fresh in their memory, trying to represent the indescribable. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a visual and literary allegory of the universality of death. It depicts skeletons, or personified figures of death, dancing and leading people from all social classes, kings, popes, bishops, peasants, children, merchants, towards the grave. It didn't matter your status, your wealth, or your piety. Death would take you to its dance. It was a brutal and democratic reminder of mortality. These representations appeared in mural frescoes in churches and cemeteries, in illuminated manuscripts, and in prints. The details were often raw and graphic, showing decomposing bodies, smiling skeletons, and the helplessness of the living. Beyond the danse macabre, art from the post-plague era became darker and more obsessed with death. Representations of the Last Judgment, hell, and Christ's suffering became more frequent and more vivid. The iconography of the Black Death also included the figures of Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch, who became patron saints against the plague, invoked for protection. Art not only reflected fear and despair, it also served as a way to process trauma, to give visual form to an invisible calamity, and to remind people of the fragility of life and the inevitability of death. It was a visceral expression of the collective psyche of a traumatized Europe. The Black Death, by sowing chaos and despair, also fueled fear and paranoia, which unfortunately led to an increase in witch hunts and new forms of superstition. Imagine a world without scientific explanations, where the inexplicable is attributed to malevolent supernatural forces. If the plague was not divine punishment, who was to blame? The answer was often found in the figure of the witch, the heretic, or any other social outcast. Women, especially elderly or solitary ones, were particularly vulnerable to these accusations. They were accused of practicing black magic, making pacts with the devil to cause the disease, or using evil potions to spread it. Although the great era of European witch hunts would occur centuries later, the seeds of this paranoia were sown during the Black Death. People sought easy explanations for an incomprehensible horror, and the witch scapegoat offered an outlet for frustration and fear. In parallel, superstitions soared. People resorted to amulets, spells, strange rituals, and all sorts of magical practices to try and protect themselves. Belief in the efficacy of certain herbs, wearing certain objects, or performing certain actions to ward off the disease was common. Although the church tried to combat them, popular desperation often superseded official doctrine. The Black Death was not just a public health crisis, it was a crisis of rationality, revealing the fragility of the human mind when faced with incomprehensible terror, and the ease with which paranoia can degenerate into violence against the innocent. The impact of the Black Death on knowledge and education was profound and in many respects devastating, leading to a temporary decline in intellectual and artistic life. Imagine a university, the center of wisdom and learning, where suddenly half of its professors and students die. European universities, such as those in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, were decimated by the plague. The loss of scholars, theologians, philosophers, and artists was immense and irreplaceable in the short term. Entire generations of talent were annihilated. Many centers of learning closed their doors or saw their quality drastically decline, as vacant positions often had to be filled by less qualified individuals due to scarcity. The transmission of knowledge was interrupted. Manuscripts were lost or left unfinished. The production of new literary and artistic works decreased. Beyond academia, the intellectual and artistic output of the time itself was affected. The optimism of the late Gothic and the nascent Renaissance was overshadowed by the omnipresence of death. Art became darker, obsessed with mortality and suffering. However, paradoxically, the scarcity of well-educated clerics and teachers also opened an opportunity for Latin, the academic language, to lose some of its monopoly, giving a boost to vernacular languages, which became more important for daily communication and eventually for literature. Although the Black Death caused an initial decline in knowledge, it would also, in the long term, catalyze a reevaluation of educational priorities and lay the groundwork for a new type of thinking that would flourish with the Renaissance. But at that moment, it was a dark night for the mind and spirit. The Black Death was not only a crisis of faith, but it also precipitated a profound crisis of the papacy that would culminate in the Western Schism and the rise of conciliarism. Imagine the Church, supposedly infallible and divinely protected, finding itself unable to stop the plague or offer a satisfactory explanation for so much suffering. The high mortality among the clergy, from parish priests to bishops and cardinals, paralyzed ecclesiastical administration and forced the ordination of less qualified clerics. This, coupled with persistent corruption and the luxury of some prelates, fueled deep discontent among the faithful. Trust in papal authority, already weakened by the Avignon papacy, the exile of the popes in France, was further eroded. People wondered why prayer didn't work and why their spiritual leaders couldn't offer comfort or protection. The culmination of this crisis came with the Western Schism, 1378 to 1417, when the Church had 2 and even 3 rival popes, each claiming to be the true successor of Peter, and excommunicating the others. This spectacle of disunity and rivalry at the top of the church was a devastating blow to its prestige and authority. The crisis of the papacy, exacerbated by the Black Death, led to a movement known as conciliarism, which held that supreme authority in the church resided in a general council of bishops, not in the pope. Although conciliarism ultimately did not prevail, the Black Death sowed the seeds of discontent and questioning of authority, paving the way for even greater challenges to the Catholic Church's hegemony centuries later. During the Protestant Reformation, the Black Death left a devastating and moving legacy in the form of a generation of orphaned children. Imagine the scale. Millions of children lost one or both parents in a short period. Entire villages saw their child populations decimated by the disease, while others were left completely alone. There were no social welfare systems or large-scale organized orphanages as we know them today. Most orphaned children were left to the care of distant relatives, the local community, or the charity of the church, if these institutions were still standing and not also decimated. Many were abandoned or forced to fend for themselves at an early age. This generation of orphans grew up in a deeply traumatized world, with a visceral understanding of the fragility of life and the omnipresence of death. Many of them had to assume adult responsibilities prematurely, working in the fields or cities from a very young age and adapting to a brutal reality. Their education, if they had any, was often interrupted. The long-term psychological impact on these children is incalculable. They lived with the memory of massive loss and the panic that accompanied it. This generation, marked by trauma, was also forced to rebuild society from its foundations to fill the gaps left by their elders. Although precise statistics are difficult to obtain, the trail of children orphaned by the Black Death is one of the most heartbreaking facets of the pandemic, a silent reminder of the truncated lives and uncertain future that many had to face. The Black Death was not only a calamity for those who died, but also a transformative force for those who survived, especially regarding property and inheritances. Imagine that half the adult population in your village disappears. The result was a massive reconfiguration of property and wealth. Those who survived often found themselves inheriting goods, land, or even titles from relatives who had succumbed to the plague. The figure of the unexpected heir became common. Lands that had been in one family for generations could cousin, or even a stranger, if the direct line of succession died out. Entire villages were deserted, and their lands, houses, and goods were left ownerless, which often led to property disputes and the acquisition of land at very low prices by the few surviving individuals with resources. The absence of owners also meant that much property deteriorated or was looted. The demographic collapse also meant that the value of land drastically decreased, while the value of labor skyrocketed. This change in the relationship between land and labor was one of the most significant economic consequences of the plague. For some, the plague was a macabre opportunity for social and economic ascent, allowing them to acquire lands and riches they otherwise never could have obtained. But for most, even those who survived, the plague meant the loss of loved ones and a life marked by trauma and uncertainty, where material wealth, though welcome, could not compensate for the profound human loss. After the passing of the Black Death, one of the most unsettling visual legacies was the silence of empty villages. Imagine a landscape where, just months ago, vibrant villages flourished with the sound of rural life, the bleating of sheep, the singing of birds, the murmur of conversations. Now, only the wind whistles through the broken doors of abandoned houses. The fields, once carefully cultivated, had become expanses of weeds. Watermills stopped, their wooden wheels moldy and still. Churches, with their silent bell towers, stood as monuments to disappeared congregations. Historical and archaeological records confirm the existence of thousands of depopulated villages or plague-depopulated areas across Europe, especially in England, France, and Germany. Some of these villages were never repopulated, and their ruins still bear witness to the catastrophe today. The scale of depopulation was so great that it radically altered the rural landscape. Land that was once arable reverted to nature, becoming pastures or forests. This abandonment was not only a symbol of human devastation, but also had profound economic implications, as agricultural production plummeted. The silence of these ghost towns was not just the absence of noise. It was the silent scream of millions of lost lives, a tangible manifestation of the fragility of civilization, and a grim reminder that nature in its fury can erase the traces of humanity with brutal indifference. It was a living monument to an era of death. One of the most immediate and profound consequences of the Black Death was the drastic shortage of labor throughout Europe. Imagine that suddenly, half the workers in your region disappear. This created a completely new economic dynamic, one where for the first time in centuries, labor was more valuable than land. Before the plague, Europe had relative overpopulation, which kept wages low and most of the population in serfdom. But after the plague, the situation reversed completely. Surviving peasants and artisans found themselves in an unprecedented position of power. They could now negotiate. If a feudal lord did not offer them better conditions or wages, they could simply go to another property where wages were higher. Cities competed to attract workers. The result was a significant increase in real wages for manual laborers. Contemporary chronicles are full of complaints from lords and guilds about the arrogance of workers, who now demanded higher wages and better conditions. Governments tried to resist this trend. In England, for example, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels, but these laws were largely ineffective. The labor shortage not only transformed the economy, it also undermined the social and political structures of feudalism, giving more power to the lower classes and laying the groundwork for a more mobile and less rigidly stratified society. The massive suffering of the plague, ironically, led to an improvement in the quality of life for surviving workers. The labor shortage brought about by the Black Death acted as a decisive catalyst for the end of serfdom, a system that had dominated feudal Europe for centuries. Imagine millions of people tied to the land, forced to work for a lord in exchange for protection and a small plot of land. The Black Death broke these chains. With the drastic reduction of the peasant population, feudal lords found themselves in an untenable situation. Their lands lay uncultivated, their rents decreased, and their incomes plummeted. They could no longer afford to be so demanding. Surviving peasants, aware of their newfound bargaining power, began to demand better conditions. Many refused to perform the forced labor, corvées, that was part of their serfdom, or simply fled to other properties where they were offered wages instead of forced labor. Faced with the threat of economic ruin, many lords were forced to commute service obligations for monetary payments, rents, or even to sell land and allow the freedom of their serfs in exchange for money. The demand for labor was so high that peasants could, for the first time, choose which lord to serve and at what price. Although serfdom did not disappear overnight and persisted in some regions, especially in Eastern Europe, for centuries, its decline in Western Europe greatly accelerated after the Black Death. The demographic catastrophe ironically, granted peasants a degree of freedom and social mobility they could not have imagined before the plague, transforming the basic structure of feudal society and paving the way for the emergence of a more money-based and wage labor economy. The scarcity of labor and the growing bargaining power of peasants, a direct consequence of the Black Death, were not always met with gratitude by the ruling class. In fact, they often led to tensions and a series of violent peasant revolts across Europe. Imagine feudal lords, accustomed to having absolute control over their serfs, trying to reimpose old burdens or fix maximum wages to prevent labor costs from rising. This resistance to post-plague changes sparked an explosion of anger and frustration among the peasantry, who had realized their own value. In France, the most famous revolt was the Jacquerie of 1358. Desperate and angry peasants, fed up with feudal oppression and the nobility's inability to protect them during the plague, rose up in arms. They attacked castles, looted estates, and murdered nobles, though the revolt was brutally suppressed. In England, Wat Tyler's rebellion of 1381 was even more significant. Driven by a combination of unpopular taxes, such as the poll tax to fund the 100 Years' War, and the persistent resistance of lords to accept new wages and peasant freedom, thousands of peasants marched on London. They demanded the end of serfdom, reduced taxes, and freedom for all. Although the rebellion was ultimately suppressed and its leaders executed, it sent a clear message to the elite that the old order was crumbling and that the lower classes would no longer tolerate oppression without resistance. These revolts, though often failing in their immediate objectives, demonstrated the profound social impact of the Black Death and accelerated the transformation of feudalism, forcing existing powers to grudgingly acknowledge the new labor and social realities. The Black Death not only decimated populations, but also led to a significant decline of many old cities, while paradoxically, it opened the way for the rise of new urban centers or the relocation of populations. Imagine a densely populated medieval city with its narrow streets and precarious dwellings. These were the most vulnerable to the plague. When the disease struck, mortality was immense, and those who survived often fled in terror. Some cities never recovered from this demographic bleeding. Their economies collapsed, their markets closed, and urban infrastructure deteriorated. What had been prosperous commercial cities or administrative centers could be reduced to mere shadows of their former glory. The countryside also suffered, and many small villages were completely depopulated, becoming ghost towns. However, massive depopulation also freed up land and resources. Some survivors migrated to smaller towns or less affected rural areas, or to places where labor shortages offered new opportunities. This, combined with the new economic dynamic of higher wages, sometimes led to the flourishing of new commercial or production centers in areas that were previously less prominent. Cities that managed to recover often did so through immigration from rural areas or from other, less fortunate cities, reconfiguring the distribution of the population on the continent. The decline of ancient cities was a testament to the brutality of the plague, which not only killed people, but also altered the urban landscape and the economic and political hierarchies of the time, rewriting Europe's demographic geography. Paradoxically, amidst the devastation of the Black Death, the labor shortage and economic reconfiguration opened the door to the rise of new commercial centers and the prosperity of some cities that managed to adapt. Imagine a market where suddenly there are few artisans but high demand, or a port that, due to the annihilation of a rival port, becomes the new center of gravity for trade. The Black Death did not eliminate trade, It simply redirected and transformed it. With the fall of many Mediterranean and inland port cities, others, often initially less densely populated or with better sanitary measures, if they existed at all, were able to prosper. Economic power began to decentralize in some respects. Cities with access to safer maritime routes or intact resource sources could take advantage of new opportunities. A labor shortage, although initially disastrous, in the long term led to innovation and investment in technology to compensate for the lack of workers. For example, textile manufacturing, which was labor-intensive, had to seek new efficiencies. Furthermore, the death of many wealthy individuals and nobles often meant that their fortunes passed into the hands of fewer people, concentrating wealth and sometimes investing it in new ventures. The demand for agricultural products also changed, leading to specialization in certain regions. The rise of new commercial centers was not a consequence of the plague itself, but of adaptation to new demographic and economic realities. The plague was a brutal equalizer, but also a force that, by destroying the old, created space for the new to emerge from the ashes. The Black Death not only impacted the peasantry and merchants, it also severely hit the nobility, especially regarding land rents. Imagine a social class whose wealth and power are fundamentally based on the possession of vast tracts of land and the labor that cultivates them. Before the plague, the abundance of peasants kept land rents low and allowed lords to impose burdensome obligations. After the Black Death, the situation drastically reversed. With the death of millions of peasants, land, once the most valuable resource, lost much of its value. There was plenty of land, but few people to cultivate it. The rents that lords could collect plummeted. Surviving peasants, aware of their bargaining power, demanded higher wages or more favorable lease conditions. Many nobles found themselves in a severe economic crisis. Their incomes drastically decreased, while their expenses, to maintain their armies, castles, and lifestyles, did not. Some tried to reimpose forms of serfdom or tighten laws to force peasants to stay, which, as we saw, often led to revolts. Others were forced to sell land, mortgage themselves, or seek new sources of income, often in trade or royal service. This economic pressure led to a gradual decline in the economic power of the landed nobility in many parts of Western Europe. Although the nobility as a class would persist for centuries, the Black Death was a key factor in the erosion of their absolute economic dominance and in the transformation of the feudal structure, forcing them to adapt to a new reality where labor was the scarce and valuable resource. The massive depopulation caused by the Black Death led to fundamental changes in agricultural practices. Imagine vast tracts of arable land that suddenly have no one to cultivate them. Before the plague, European agriculture was labor-intensive, with a large peasant population working the land manually to produce cereals, mainly wheat and barley. But with the scarcity of workers, this model became unsustainable. Surviving lords and peasants were forced to seek new forms of agriculture that required less labor. One solution was the conversion of cultivated land into pastures for livestock farming. Livestock farming, especially sheep breeding for wool production, was much less labor-intensive than grain cultivation. This led to a significant increase in the production of meat, milk, and dairy products, as well as wool, which was a very valuable commodity for trade. The diet of the surviving population also changed. With more access to meat and dairy products, and often greater purchasing power, people ate better and with a more varied diet. In addition, the labor shortage encouraged innovation in some areas, such as the development of new agricultural tools or crop rotation techniques to maximize efficiency. The Black Death not only devastated the countryside, it also transformed it, forcing farmers to adapt to new demographic and economic realities, laying the groundwork for a more diversified and, in the long run, more productive agricultural system. It was a radical reconfiguration of the European rural landscape. The Black Death not only altered the demographic and economic landscape, but also had a surprising impact on the consumption and spending behavior of survivors. Imagine that, for the first time, the lower classes have more money to spend. With the scarcity of labor, the wages of peasants and artisans soared, and many also benefited from unexpected inheritances from deceased relatives. This led to a significant increase in the purchasing power of the lower strata of society. People who before could barely afford subsistence could now buy goods that were once considered luxuries. The demand for better quality products, finer clothing, and a more varied diet with more meat and dairy products increased. This, in turn, stimulated artisanal production in some sectors. However, there was also a duality in behavior. For some, the experience of the plague led them to unrestrained hedonism, living in the moment and spending freely as death could strike at any time. For others, the trauma of the plague instilled greater caution and a desire to save or invest, aware of the fragility of life. Sumptuary laws, which attempted to limit excessive spending by the lower classes on luxuries to maintain social order, became more common but were often ineffective. The Black Death, by redistributing wealth in an unprecedented way, created a new class of consumers and a shift in spending patterns. This transformation not only affected the economy, but also reflected a change in the mentality of people who had survived an apocalypse and now faced a world where old rules did not always apply. The Black Death was an event of such magnitude that it brutally and unprecedentedly redefined Europe's demographic pyramid. Imagine a society where the young and productive population is disproportionately decimated, along with the elderly and most vulnerable. The plague not only drastically reduced the size of the population, it also altered its age and gender structure. Mortality was particularly high in urban areas and among those with greater exposure, such as clerics, doctors, and gravediggers. This meant that many communities lost a large part of their young adults, those who were the workforce and reproductive force. Birth rates plummeted dramatically during and after the plague, as marriage and reproduction were interrupted by death, fear, and social dissolution. It is estimated that the European population took between 150 and 250 years to recover to pre-plague levels. This recovery, however, was not uniform and varied considerably from region to region. The demographic pyramid narrowed at its base and widened in the surviving age groups, creating a generational imbalance. This had profound implications for society, the economy, and culture. Fewer mouths to feed, but also fewer hands to work. The Black Death was not only an event of mass mortality, it was a demographic recalibration that redefined the composition of European society for centuries, leaving a deep mark on collective memory and on how subsequent generations would see themselves and their world. The recovery from the Black Death was not a rapid or uniform process. It was a slow and differentiated convalescence that lasted for centuries. Imagine a seriously ill patient recovering very slowly, with occasional relapses. Europe did not recover from the plague overnight. The population took, as we already mentioned, between 150 and 250 years to return to its pre-1347 levels. And this recovery was not homogeneous. Some regions, such as parts of England and the Low Countries, experienced a faster recovery due to factors such as greater social mobility, agricultural innovations, and prosperous trade. Other regions, especially in Southern Europe and parts of Eastern Europe, took much longer to recover, or even experienced a long-term decline. The recurrences of the plague were a key factor. The Black Death did not disappear completely after 1351. There were recurrent outbreaks, though generally less lethal, that struck Europe every 10 to 20 years during the following centuries, preventing sustained demographic recovery. The last major plague pandemic in Europe was the Great Plague of London in 1665. This persistence of the disease maintained constant demographic and psychological pressure. Economic recovery was also gradual. While wages increased for workers, total production decreased and investments were affected by uncertainty. The Black Death was a long-lasting trauma that forced a fundamental reevaluation of society, the economy, and institutions. Human resilience was tested again and again, and the Europe that emerged from this long convalescence was fundamentally different from what existed before the plague. The Black Death, by decimating the nobility and undermining feudal structures, paradoxically contributed to the strengthening of centralized states and the power of kings. Imagine a king who suddenly finds that many of his most powerful nobles have died, or that their land revenues have drastically decreased. This created an opportunity for monarchs. Before the plague, power was highly dispersed in feudal Europe, with numerous lords and barons exercising almost autonomous authority in their territories. But with the Black Death, many of these lords lost their properties, their families became extinct, or they were economically weakened by labor shortages and falling rents. Kings were able to take advantage of this weakness to consolidate their own power. They could confiscate land from nobles without heirs or sell offices and favors to a new ascending elite, often burghers or lawyers, who owed them direct loyalty rather than to a feudal lineage. The labor shortage also led kings to rely more on paid mercenary armies rather than feudal levies, which gave them greater military control. Furthermore, the need to coordinate responses to the plague, even if ineffective, and the subsequent need for reconstruction prompted kings to create more centralized and efficient bureaucracies to collect taxes, administer justice, and maintain order. The Black Death did not overthrow feudalism overnight, but it was a decisive blow that accelerated its decline and paved the way for the era of nation-states and absolute monarchies. Power moved from feudal castles to royal palaces. As we have already suggested, the Black Death was an existential blow to feudalism, the dominant social, economic, and political system in medieval Europe. Imagine a social pyramid with the king at the top, followed by the landed nobility, and at the base, the vast majority of the population, the peasants and serfs tied to the land. The plague, by killing millions of peasants, shattered the foundations of this pyramid. The labor shortage, as we saw, gave unprecedented bargaining power to the survivors, allowing them to demand higher wages, commute services for money, or even flee the land. This undermined the essence of serfdom, which was the economic pillar of feudalism. Feudal lords, who once depended on the abundance of labor to cultivate their lands, found themselves with decreasing incomes and an inability to enforce old obligations. Many were forced to sell land or free their serfs. The demographic collapse also meant a disruption in loyalty and military service. Nobles, who owed military service to the king, often struggled to raise their men for war. This led to an increased reliance on mercenary armies paid directly by kings, which, as we mentioned, strengthened centralized power. Although feudalism did not disappear immediately, and its vestiges persisted for centuries, the Black Death was the trigger for its accelerated decline in Western Europe. It opened a path toward a more mobile society, more based on money and contract than on birth status and forced service. A fundamental change that would set the stage for the modern era. The Black Death was not only a crisis of faith, but it also precipitated a profound crisis of the papacy that would culminate in the Western Schism and the rise of conciliarism. Imagine the Church, supposedly infallible and divinely protected, finding itself unable to stop the plague or offer a satisfactory explanation for so much suffering. The high mortality among the clergy. From parish priests to bishops and cardinals, paralyzed ecclesiastical administration and forced the ordination of less qualified clerics. This, coupled with persistent corruption and the luxury of some prelates, fueled deep discontent among the faithful. Trust in papal authority, already weakened by the Avignon papacy, the exile of the popes in France, was further eroded. People wondered why prayer didn't work, and why their spiritual leaders couldn't offer comfort or protection. The culmination of this crisis came with the Western Schism, 1378 to 1417, when the Church had 2 and even 3 rival popes, each claiming to be the true successor of Peter and excommunicating the others. This spectacle of disunity and rivalry at the top of the Church was a devastating blow to its prestige and authority. The crisis of the papacy, exacerbated by the Black Death, led to a movement known as conciliarism, which held that supreme authority in the Church resided in a general council of bishops, not in the Pope. Although conciliarism ultimately did not prevail, the Black Death sowed the seeds of discontent and questioning of authority, paving the way for even greater challenges to the Catholic Church's hegemony centuries later, during the Protestant Reformation. One of the most significant and lasting cultural effects of the Black Death was the rise of vernacular languages and the gradual decline of Latin as the dominant language. Imagine a world where education, law, theology, and government were conducted almost exclusively in Latin, a language mastered only by a small literate elite, primarily clerics. The Black Death decimated this elite. The mass death of university professors, monks, and scribes meant there were far fewer individuals trained to teach and transmit Latin. Universities, upon reopening, often had to hire teachers less versed in the classical language. Furthermore, the need for rapid and pragmatic communication in a world in crisis boosted the use of languages spoken by common people. The few who could write often had to do so in the people's language for their messages to be understood by the masses. For example, to issue edicts or record wills. Literature was also affected. Authors like Boccaccio in Italy and Chaucer in England began to write their most important works in their native languages, Tuscan and Middle English, respectively. This not only democratized literature, making it accessible to a wider audience, but also elevated the status of these vernacular languages. Latin remained important for the Church and academia for centuries, but its monopoly had been broken. The Black Death, by disrupting the traditional transmission of knowledge and forcing people to communicate in more direct ways, accelerated the development and standardization of national languages, a crucial step in the formation of the European cultural identities we know today. The Black Death not only decimated university populations, but also had a significant impact on education and curricula, forcing changes in how and what was taught. Imagine an education system where the primary emphasis was on theology, scholastic philosophy, and traditional liberal arts, all taught in Latin. When the plague struck, the massive loss of professors and students, combined with economic crisis and social disorder, led to a temporary decline in the quality and scope of education. However, In the long term, the Black Death catalyzed some important changes. With the labor shortage and the need for professionals, there was a growing demand for more practical knowledge. Medicine, though ineffective against the plague, was forced into a re-evaluation. There was greater interest in anatomy and surgery, as direct observation of plague victims' bodies and post-mortem autopsies began to challenge old theories. Although rudimentary, the first steps toward a more empirical approach began. Furthermore, the loss of well-trained clerics and lawyers led to a demand for new people to fill these positions, which spurred the creation of new, smaller universities, or the expansion of existing ones. And, as we already mentioned, the decline of Latin paved the way for teaching in vernacular languages. The Black Death did not reform education overnight, but it was a trigger that, by destabilizing the old order, encouraged greater flexibility and a growing inclination toward humanism and empiricism, laying the groundwork for the Renaissance and the subsequent scientific revolution. Although the Protestant Reformation had its deep causes in centuries of theological, political, and social discontent, the Black Death undoubtedly sowed some of the seeds of that discontent. Imagine a population traumatized by mass death, which had seen the Church, the supposed intermediary between God and men, rendered powerless against the plague. A crisis of faith and distrust in ecclesiastical authority, already mentioned, were direct consequences. The Black Death not only revealed people's physical vulnerability, but also the perceived weakness of spiritual institutions. Clerical mortality had led to the ordination of less qualified men, resulting in a less pious clergy more prone to corruption. The sale of ecclesiastical offices, simony, and indulgences, already common before the plague, became even more offensive in the eyes of a population that had suffered so much. People began to yearn for a more direct and personal relationship with God, without the need for an ecclesiastical hierarchy that seemed not to have protected them. The emphasis on personal penitence, as seen in the flagellant movement, was a manifestation of this desire. The Black Death also spurred the development of personal devotion and the reading of religious texts in vernacular languages, which in turn empowered the laity to interpret scriptures for themselves, without exclusively depending on the clergy. Although Luther would not be born for another century and a half, the doubts and fundamental questions about the Church's authority and the nature of faith, which the Black Death had raised in the minds of millions, would create fertile ground for the reformist ideas that would explode in the 16th century. In response to the devastation of the Black Death and the recurrent outbreaks that followed, new public health laws and regulations emerged, marking the incipient birth of sanitary awareness in Europe. Imagine municipal authorities, desperate to contain the disease, implementing measures that, though rudimentary, laid the foundations for future practices. Venice, a densely populated maritime city and highly vulnerable, was a pioneer in implementing quarantine. In 1348, the authorities of Ragusa, Dubrovnik, under Venetian influence, ordered that sailors and merchants from infected areas isolate themselves for 30 days, a Trentino, before being allowed to enter the city. Later, this period was extended to 40 days, a quarantina, from which the current word derives, based on the idea that this was the time needed for the disease to manifest or for the danger to pass. This marked a milestone in the history of being the first time isolation was used as a large-scale preventive measure. In addition to quarantine, cities began to implement other regulations, such as street cleaning, though very rudimentary, the prohibition of dumping garbage and corpses into rivers, and the organization of more controlled mass burials outside city limits. Health officers, or plague inspectors, were also appointed in some cities to monitor the situation and enforce regulations. Although these measures were often insufficient and late, an understanding of the disease remained flawed. They represented a fundamental change in the perception of disease. The Black Death forced authorities to recognize that public health was a matter of governance, and not just divine destiny, laying the groundwork for future state interventions in health and sanitation. The 100 Years' War, already underway when the Black Death erupted in Europe, was a brutal and prolonged conflict between England and France that, far from being halted by the plague, was in many respects exacerbated by it. Imagine two kingdoms, already exhausted by decades of conflict, suddenly facing an invisible enemy that decimated their armies and populations. Instead of a lasting truce, the plague created an environment of increased instability and opportunity for aggression. The disruption of agriculture, the labor shortage, and the consequent fall in tax revenues severely hit the finances of both kingdoms, making it difficult to maintain large armies. However, depopulation also meant there were fewer people to recruit, leading to a greater reliance on mercenaries and changes in military tactics. Troop discipline and morale were affected by fear of the plague. There were times when military campaigns stopped or were delayed due to plague outbreaks in the armies or in the regions they passed through. The irony, as we saw with the case of Scotland, was that sometimes campaigning armies carried the plague with them, spreading it to new areas. Although the war was sporadically interrupted due to disease, it also resumed with renewed ferocity. Noble elites, suffering from the post-plague economic crisis, often sought war as a way to restore their honor, loot riches, and divert attention from internal problems. The Black Death did not end the 100 Years' War. Rather, it transformed it into an even grimmer, more prolonged, and more costly conflict, whose demographic and economic consequences were even more devastating due to the overlapping of war and plague. While the Black Death caused havoc in the countryside and feudal structures, it paradoxically contributed to the strengthening of cities and the growing power of the bourgeoisie. Imagine a city, decimated by the plague, but still offering the promise of a better life for rural survivors. With the labor shortage in the countryside, many surviving peasants fled to cities in search of better wages and opportunities, or to escape feudal oppression. This, in the long run, helped in the repopulation and recovery of many urban areas. The Black Death also spurred a concentration of wealth in cities. With the death of many landowners and nobles and the fall in land value, wealth shifted to the hands of merchants, artisans, and bankers, the bourgeoisie, who managed money and trade. These burghers, who had already been an ascending force before the plague, saw their economic and political influence increase. They could invest in businesses, acquire properties at low prices, and finance kings, which gave them greater weight in political decisions. Cities, with their artisan guilds and merchant corporations, consolidated their autonomy from the feudal nobility. They developed their own laws, their own tax systems, and often their own militias. Although the plague was initially devastating for cities, in the long term, the demographic and economic shift gave them a significant boost. They became centers of innovation, trade, and political power, setting the stage for the Renaissance and the era of large commercial city-states that would characterize later centuries. The Black Death, by breaking the old mold, forged a new path for urbanism and the bourgeoisie. Although the Black Death of the mid-14th century was the most devastating outbreak, the disease did not completely disappear from Europe. Imagine a ghost that periodically returns to remind you of its presence. Over the following centuries, bubonic plague and its pneumonic and septicemic variants became a recurrent presence in European life. There were local, regional, and sometimes pan-European outbreaks every 10, 20, or 30 years. Famous outbreaks include the Great Plague of London, 1665, the Plague of Marseille, 1720, and the Plague of Moscow, 1771. These later outbreaks, although often deadly at a local level, rarely reached the same devastating demographic scale as the original 14th century pandemic. This was due to several factors. The population had developed a certain immunity. Quarantine and public health measures were slightly more effective, and living and trade patterns had changed. The recurrent fear of the plague became an inherent part of the European psyche. People lived with the awareness that the disease could return at any time. This influenced architecture, houses with more ventilation, funeral customs, and a preparedness of authorities. The experience of the original plague had etched such a deep collective memory that the threat, even when it did not materialize, influenced government decisions and daily life. Plague doctors with their bird masks, though popularized in the 17th century, became a symbol of this continuous struggle. The Black Death was not just a historical event, but also a persistent shadow that haunted Europe for centuries, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictability of diseases. The devastation of the Black Death, though incomprehensible at the time, paradoxically spurred certain advances in anatomy and surgery, as the most extreme necessity became the mother of invention. Imagine the doctors of the time, unable to cure, but forced to deal with thousands of bodies. Before the plague, dissection of corpses was a rare practice, often forbidden or frowned upon by the church. However, with so many dead and the desperate need to understand the disease, autopsies became more common, or at least more tolerated, to examine the buboes and other effects of the disease on the body. This led to greater direct observation of human anatomy, knowledge that was scarce and often based on ancient and sometimes erroneous texts. Although doctors did not understand the bacterial cause of the plague, their post-mortem observations allowed them to more accurately describe the symptoms and internal changes produced by the disease. Barber surgeons, who were less academic and more practical than university physicians, also gained importance. They were dedicated to draining buboes and performing other rudimentary surgical interventions, though without any understanding of asepsis. The sheer magnitude of death forced a re-evaluation of medical theories. Although progress was slow and the plague remained incomprehensible for centuries, the experience of the Black Death sowed the seeds for a more empirical approach to medicine and a greater interest in anatomy and physiology, gradually challenging ancient dogmas and paving the way for the medical renaissance that would emerge in the following centuries. As already mentioned, the Black Death was the catalyst for the birth of quarantine, a health strategy that, although rudimentary at first, became a cornerstone of modern public health. Imagine the citizens of Ragusa, today Dubrovnik, a port city on the Adriatic Sea, watching in horror as ships arrived from ports already devastated by the plague. In 1377, they made an innovative and, for the time, radical decision to prohibit all travelers and crews arriving from plague-affected areas from disembarking until they had spent 30 days, the Trentino, isolated in a safe place outside the city. The measure was a desperate attempt to protect the population. Soon after, Venice, always at the forefront of trade and innovation, extended this period to 40 days, from which the term quarantine derives. The number 40 had biblical symbolism, the 40 days of Lent, the 40 days of flood, etc., which made it culturally acceptable. The first lazarets, or quarantine stations, were established on islands or in remote locations near ports. These were places where ships and their passengers were detained and observed to see if they developed the disease. The idea was simple. If they got sick, the plague would be contained away from the population. Quarantine was a public health measure that was not based on a scientific understanding of germs, but on the empirical observation that isolation seemed to reduce the spread of the disease. It was an act of pragmatic ingenuity in the midst of medical ignorance, and its legacy endures to this day as one of the most fundamental tools in the fight against infectious diseases. In a world without an understanding of germs, the Black Death, ironically, led people to rediscover the importance, albeit in an incipient way, of ventilation and cleanliness. Imagine medieval doctors clinging to the miasma theory, the belief that diseases were caused by bad airs or putrid vapors. Although the premise was wrong, their conclusions often led to practices that purely by coincidence helped mitigate the spread. If the disease came from bad air, then cleaner air must be better, right? And it was logical to try to purify it. This led to recommendations to ventilate houses, open windows, and eliminate sources of bad odors, such as corpses or waste. The burning of aromatic herbs, incense, or wood in the streets or inside houses was a common practice, not only to mask the stench, but with the belief that the smoke would purify the air. Municipal authorities also began to take some, albeit rudimentary, measures to clean streets and remove garbage. Although these actions did not stop the spread of flea and rat-borne plague, improved cleanliness and ventilation, even if their purpose was incorrect, had marginal benefits for general health and hygiene. The Black Death, by making the connection between disease and air, though mistakenly, pushed society toward greater awareness of sanitation and the need to maintain cleaner environments. It was a small but significant step on the long road to understanding public health. The Black Death, despite the medical ignorance of the era, catalyzed a movement towards empirical observation, a form of knowledge based on experience and experimentation, which would go beyond superstition and ancient dogmas. Imagine doctors facing a disease that defied all their existing theories. Bloodletting did not work, amulets did not protect, prayers did not heal. Helplessness forced some to observe in more detail what was actually happening. Although they did not have microscopes to see bacteria, they could observe patterns: who became ill, how the disease spread, though misinterpreting the mechanism, and what actions seemed to have some effect, like isolation. The practice of autopsy, although infrequent, became more accepted in some places to examine bodies and buboes, looking for clues about the cause and progress of the disease. Mortality records, though inaccurate, attempted to quantify the catastrophe. The direct and brutal experience of the plague undermined the authority of medical theories rooted in Galen and the humors, as they could neither explain nor cure the Black Death. Although the modern science of epidemiology would not be born for centuries later, the Black Death was a trauma that, by destroying old certainties, forced some thinkers to doubt preconceived explanations and to seek answers in direct observation of nature. It was a painful but crucial step in the evolution of scientific thought, a germ of the mentality that would flourish in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. The practice of autopsy, though rare and often frowned upon in medieval Europe, experienced a small but significant boost during the Black Death, marking a crucial step towards a deeper understanding of human anatomy and pathology. Imagine the desperation of doctors and authorities in the face of massive and mysterious death. With the accumulation of bodies and the urgent need to understand the disease that killed them, examining corpses became more acceptable and even necessary. Before the plague, most anatomical knowledge was based on ancient texts, often from Galen, which in turn were based on the dissection of animals, not humans. Human dissection was taboo in many places. However, the Black Death broke these barriers. Doctors and surgeons began to perform rudimentary autopsies to directly observe the buboes, the state of internal organs, and other changes in the bodies of plague victims. For example, in 1348, Gentile da Foligno, a physician from Perugia, performed what is considered the first known autopsy of a plague victim, seeking a cause. Although his conclusions about the disease were erroneous, he believed it was a form of poisoning. The act of dissection to investigate disease was an important precedent. These autopsies, although they did not reveal the bacterial cause of the plague, did contribute to a more precise understanding of human anatomy and how the disease affected the body. The Black Death, macabrely, provided an unprecedented opportunity for the study of anatomy, pushing the limits of what was acceptable in medical research and laying the groundwork for significant advances that would occur in the Renaissance. The Black Death and the recurrent outbreaks that followed spurred the creation and expansion of lazarets, institutions that would become the prototype of modern isolation hospitals. Imagine the desperate need to contain the disease and protect the healthy population. The initial idea of quarantine, established in cities like Ragusa and Venice, required places where travelers and the sick could be isolated. Thus, lazarets were born. The first official lazaret, the Lazaretto Vecchio, was established in Venice in 1423, on a remote island in the lagoon. It was a complex where passengers from ships suspected of carrying the plague were interned for a period of time, and where sick people with confirmed symptoms were isolated. These lazarets were, in essence, hospitals for patients with infectious diseases, although their main objective was the containment of the disease, not its cure. The buildings were often simple and conditions precarious. They were built in isolated locations to prevent spread, and often had their own cemeteries. The creation of lazarets marked a fundamental step in public health. A represented the first time governments took responsibility for isolating the sick to protect the community, instead of simply waiting for the disease to subside or fleeing. These establishments, and the concept of isolation they represented, were replicated throughout Europe and were crucial for controlling subsequent outbreaks of plague and other infectious diseases. Lazarets are a lasting legacy of the Black Death, a testament to human adaptation in the face of an existential threat, laying the groundwork for containment practices we still use today. The Black Death, by confronting society with a visibly horrendous and deadly disease, also catalyzed the first, albeit rudimentary, attempts at protective clothing for medical personnel and those dealing with bodies. Imagine the need to approach the sick and dead without succumbing to the same fate. Although the famous bird beak mask did not appear until the 17th century, the experience of the Black Death did prompt an awareness of the need for some form of physical barrier. Doctors and gravediggers of the Black Death era, not understanding transmission by germs or fleas, primarily protected themselves from bad airs, miasmas. This led to the use of cloths or rags over the mouth and nose, often soaked in vinegar or aromatic essences, to try and filter the air. They are also known to have worn thick clothing and cloaks to avoid direct contact with bodies or bodily fluids. Although primitive, these were the first steps toward the concept of personal protective equipment, PPE. The full design of the 17th century plague doctor, with his waxed coat, gloves, wide-brimmed hat, and beak mask, was an evolution of this basic idea, designed by Charles Delorme. The waxed coat was considered impermeable to miasmas, and the beak was filled with aromatic herbs. The Black Death, therefore, although with a flawed understanding of the disease, was the first great shock that forced those on the front lines to actively consider how to protect themselves from an invisible enemy. It was a lesson learned at an unimaginable cost. but one that would ultimately contribute to the development of modern medicine and hygiene practices. The Black Death, being an indecipherable mystery for medieval science, led to a desperate and often erroneous search for its causes and remedies. Imagine the people of the time trying to make sense of a calamity that defied all logic. The dominant theory was that of miasmas, the idea that the disease was caused by bad airs, toxic vapors emanating from decaying matter or from the unfavorable conjunction of planets. This led to remedies such as burning aromatic herbs to purify the air, opening windows to ventilate spaces, or avoiding bad odors. Another popular theory, especially among the clergy, was that the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. This led to prayer, penance, flagellant processions, and tragically, pogroms against Jews and other minorities, accused of poisoning wells or being the agents of divine wrath. Doctors and alchemists also sought miraculous remedies. All kinds of potions and elixirs were tried, many of them based on medicinal herbs, some with real properties and others useless or even toxic. Strange ointments were applied to buboes. Decoctions were drunk. Bloodletting and purges were performed. Some believed that the blood of a crow or a toad or animal manure could cure the disease. Desperation led to experiments with precious metals such as gold or rare substances. The irony of this search was that, despite the immense energy and often grotesque methods, the true bacterial cause of the plague would remain unknown for centuries. The Black Death was a brutal reminder of the limits of human knowledge in the Middle Ages, and people's capacity to invent explanations and solutions in the absence of truth. Beyond death and devastation, the Black Death also revealed astonishing human resilience, adaptability, and the will of people to survive. Imagine having lost half your family and friends, having lived in a world of fear and anarchy, and yet finding the strength to continue. Survivors not only rebuilt their lives, they rebuilt entire societies. The labor shortage led to the negotiation of higher wages and better conditions for peasants and artisans. The dissolution of old structures opened the way for new social and economic opportunities. The Black Death forced innovation in agriculture, in public health with quarantine, and in administration. People learned to live with the constant threat of the plague, developing greater awareness of hygiene, though rudimentary, and isolation. Communities came together to bury their dead, and in many cases, to support each other despite the fear. The Black Death changed the European mindset. Although the trauma persisted, a new pragmatism also emerged, a deeper appreciation for life, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. The human spirit, far from being broken, showed an incredible capacity to adapt to the most adverse circumstances, to innovate, and to rebuild. The Black Death was the toughest test to which European civilization was subjected, and although the cost was immense, survival itself and the subsequent recovery demonstrate humanity's incredible tenacity. It was a testament that, even in the face of apocalypse, life finds a way. Finally, the Black Death, after centuries of recurrent outbreaks and persistent fear, began its decline as a major pandemic in Europe. Although its genetic and cultural impact would endure, imagine a disease that has dominated life and death for more than 3 centuries, which gradually begins to retreat. Why did it stop being the annihilating force it was in the 14th century? There isn't one single reason, but a combination of factors. First, recurrent outbreaks. Though deadly, genetically selected populations, those with some natural resistance to the plague, were more likely to survive and transmit their genes, which, over time, may have led to a European population with a higher proportion of individuals genetically less susceptible to the more lethal bubonic form. Second, public health measures, though initially rudimentary, became more effective. Quarantine, lazarets, and improvements in urban hygiene, though slow, helped contain outbreaks. Third, there were changes in rat populations and housing patterns. The brown rat, larger and less prone to living in close proximity to humans than the black rat, began to displace the latter in many urban areas. There was also a gradual improvement in housing quality, making them less accessible to rats. Finally, some historians suggest that changes in the virulence of Yersinia pestis itself, or in the efficiency of its transmission, might have contributed. A last major plague pandemic in Europe was in the 18th century. Although the disease never completely disappeared, and outbreaks still exist in some parts of the world today, its era of dominance in Europe had ended. The Black Death retreated, leaving behind a transformed continent and an indelible memory of its devastating power. The Black Death left an indelible mark on literature, from the chronicles of its time to contemporary works, becoming an inexhaustible source of inspiration to explore fear, death, and the human condition. Imagine a catastrophe so profound that it resonates through the centuries. In the Middle Ages, Boccaccio's Decameron is the most famous example, a direct literary testimony to the social dissolution that accompanied the plague in Florence, where humor and tragedy intertwine. Poets like Petrarch lamented personal losses and general devastation. In later centuries, the Black Death has continued to fascinate writers. Albert Camus, in his novel, The Plague, 1947, uses the plague in Oran as an existentialist allegory of evil, absurdity, and human resistance in the face of an incomprehensible calamity, clearly inspired by the Black Death, though he relocates it to a modern context. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, in Love in the Time of Cholera, although focused on cholera, evokes an atmosphere of recurrent epidemics reminiscent of the plague experience. More recently, historical novels like Geraldine Brooks' Year of Wonders or Philip Ziegler's The Black Death have revisited the era with historical rigor and emotional depth. The Black Death in literature is not just a backdrop. It is often a character in itself, a force that compels characters to confront their deepest fears, question their faith, and redefine their values. It is a reminder that, even centuries later, the narrative of the plague remains a powerful lens through which we can examine the fragility of civilization and the resilience of the human spirit. The Black Death left a deep and lasting imprint on artistic representations, transforming medieval and Gothic iconography into a reflection of fear, death, and despair. Imagine a world where death is a constant and grotesque presence. Artworks from the period and later not only documented the plague, they personified and interpreted it. The already mentioned Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, became a popular genre, with skeletons or personified figures of death leading people from all social classes in a dance towards the grave. These mural frescoes, engravings, and sculptures, often found in cemeteries or churches, were a brutal reminder of the universality of death. Beyond the Danse Macabre, themes of the Last Judgment, hell, and Christ's suffering became more vivid and grim. Artists often depicted decomposing bodies, skeletons, and the agony of the dying. The figure of the plague doctor, with his beak, mask, though popularized in the 17th century, has become an iconic image of the era, appearing in later engravings and paintings. In devotional art, saints like Saint Roch and Saint Sebastian, associated with protection against the plague, gained popularity and were frequently depicted. Paintings and engravings often showed the buboes of the disease, the pallor of death, and the chaos of mass burials. These artistic representations not only served as a visual record of the plague, but also as a way to process collective trauma, to give form to the incomprehensible, and to channel the terror and faith of a population that had lived through the apocalypse. art became a dark mirror of the soul of a traumatized Europe. The Black Death, like few other historical calamities, has found a recurrent path in cinema and television, where its modern interpretations range from historical horror to allegory. Imagine directors and screenwriters trying to capture the magnitude of this catastrophe on screen. One of the rawest and most realistic portrayals is Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, 1957, where death personified plays chess with a medieval knight in a plague-ravaged landscape. The film masterfully captures the desperation, the crisis of faith, and the omnipresence of death. More recently, Black Death, 2010, an action horror film set in plague-ridden England, offers a more visceral and dark vision, focusing on a group of knights investigating a village supposedly immune to the disease. Although historical liberties are often taken for the sake of drama, these productions manage to convey the atmosphere of fear, social dissolution, and brutality of the era. Television series such as Nightfall or dramatic documentaries have also touched on the subject, often focusing on the chaos and despair of outbreaks. However, the challenge of depicting horror on screen without falling into sensationalism is great. Modern interpretations often use the Black Death as a broader metaphor for catastrophe, survival, and human nature under extreme pressure. In doing so, cinema and television not only entertain us, but also connect us with a terrifying past, reminding us of the fragility of our own existence and the persistent relevance of one of history's worst pandemics. The Black Death has transcended the pages of history to become a recurrent theme in video games and other interactive media, offering players a unique immersion into the brutality and impact of the pandemic. Imagine simulating life in a medieval city besieged by the plague, or managing a society struggling to survive. Games like A Plague Tale: Innocence, 2019, and its sequel, A Plague Tale: Requiem, 2022, are perhaps the most prominent examples. These action-adventure games immerse players in a medieval France devastated by the plague and hordes of rats, using the disease as a central element of gameplay and atmosphere. Environments are filled with bodies, buboes, and a palpable sense of despair. Other games, especially in the strategy or city-building genre, like Crusader Kings 3 or Age of Empires, include the Black Death as a game event that can decimate populations, affect economies, and change lines of succession. These games allow players to experience, in a controlled way, the large-scale impact of the plague. There are also independent or niche games that focus more directly on survival in a plague-ridden world, or even tabletop role-playing games that use the plague as a backdrop. These interactive media not only entertain, they also educate in an immersive way, allowing players to make decisions in an environment where survival is precarious and the consequences of the plague are tangible. In doing so, video games help keep the memory of the Black Death alive, allowing a new generation to interact with this crucial moment in human history in a unique and often terrifying way. Beyond its literal impact, the Black Death has been and continues to be used as a powerful metaphor for calamity, apocalypse, and indiscriminate annihilation. Imagine invoking an image of total disaster. When people speak of a scourge or a plague affecting a society, whether economic, political, or social, it often implicitly refers to the image of the Black Death. It is used to describe large-scale events with devastating consequences that seem uncontrollable and inevitable. For example, one might speak of a plague of corruption or a plague of unemployment to evoke a sense of overwhelming crisis. The phrase "the Black Death" has become synonymous with unprecedented disaster. It is also used to evoke the idea of the end times, an apocalypse, where social structures crumble and death reigns supreme. The experience of the Black Death left such a deep scar on the European psyche that it became the archetype of existential catastrophe. It is a metaphor that transcends the disease itself and applies to any destructive force that threatens human or social existence. This persistence of the Black Death as a metaphor reveals its lasting power in our collective imagination. It is a reminder of our fragility and history's ability to provide us with a language to describe the horrors we face, even if those horrors take a different form. The plague is no longer an omnipresent reality, but its metaphorical shadow remains long and dark. The experience of the Black Death, although centuries old, offers surprisingly relevant lessons for future pandemics and for global awareness in the modern era. Imagine reliving an event of mass mortality, but with the knowledge and tools we lacked then. The Black Death taught us the brutal truth that diseases respect no borders, social status, or wealth. It showed how a localized disease can become a global catastrophe in an interconnected world, even with the limited connectivity of the 14th century. It reminded us of the crucial importance of hygiene, sanitation, and isolation, even if people at the time didn't understand why they worked. The birth of quarantine and lazarettes are direct legacies of the Black Death, tools we still use today. It showed us how panic and ignorance can lead to scapegoating and social violence. And, crucially, it demonstrated the fragility of our institutions and the need for a coordinated, knowledge-based response. In the 21st century, with the emergence of diseases like HIV, AIDS, SARS, Ebola, and more recently, COVID-19, the lessons of the Black Death resonate with new urgency. They remind us of the importance of scientific research, robust public health systems, international cooperation, and accurate information to combat pandemics. The Black Death is not just history. It is a grim, yet vital guide for navigating the uncertainties of a future where new diseases are a constant threat, reminding us that despite all our progress, we are, ultimately, creatures of flesh and blood, at the mercy of forces that at times are beyond our control. The rediscovery of the bacterium Yersinia pestis in the modern era was a scientific milestone that finally unraveled the mystery of the Black Death, more than 500 years after its first outbreak. Imagine 19th century scientists with their microscopes and laboratories, trying to identify the causative agent of the plagues that still ravaged parts of the world. It was in 1894, during a plague outbreak in Hong Kong, when two bacteriologists, working independently, managed to identify the responsible bacterium. Alexandre Yersin, a Swiss-French physician, and Kitasato Shibasaburo, a Japanese physician and bacteriologist, both students of Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur, isolated and identified the bacterium. Yersin was the first to correctly identify it, and in his honor, the bacterium was named Yersinia pestis. This discovery was revolutionary. Finally, humanity had a scientific explanation for the Black Death. It was not divine punishment or bad air, but a bacterium. This opened the door to the development of vaccines, though the first ones were not very effective, and much later, antibiotics, which would transform plague treatment from a death sentence to a curable disease. The rediscovery of Yersinia pestis not only solved a historical mystery, but also laid the groundwork for understanding infectious diseases in general and the development of microbiology. It is a testament to the power of science to unveil the secrets of nature, even those that had sown terror for centuries, and to give us the tools to fight invisible enemies that once seemed invincible. Genetic research in the modern era has added a new layer of understanding to the history of the Black Death, allowing us to trace the bacterium Yersinia pestis through time and space with astonishing precision. Imagine being able to extract DNA from the bones of plague victims buried centuries ago in mass graves. Thanks to advances in paleogenomics, scientists have been able to recover and sequence the complete genome of Yersinia pestis from the skeletal remains of victims of the original Black Death in the 14th century. These studies have confirmed that the bacterium responsible for the Great Plague was indeed Yersinia pestis, dispelling doubts about other possible causes. Furthermore, genetic analysis has revealed the diversity of bacterial strains and allowed researchers to reconstruct the roots of its spread across Europe in unprecedented detail, confirming the theory that it came from Central Asia and dispersed through trade routes. It has also allowed for the study of the bacterium's mutations over time and an understanding of how its virulence may have evolved. Genetic research not only gives us a clearer view of the past, but also helps us better understand the evolution of pathogens and how they adapt to new hosts and environments. It teaches us about bacterial resilience and the dynamics of pandemics, providing crucial information for current public health and preparedness for future threats. The Black Death, therefore, is not just an event in history books, but a biological case study that continues to reveal its secrets through the DNA of its victims. The debate about the true mortality of the Black Death is still alive among historians, and new estimates, often based on archaeology and the analysis of detailed records, continue to refine our understanding of the scale of the catastrophe. Imagine 21st century historians and demographers trying to quantify death in a world without reliable statistics. Traditional estimates, which spoke of a third of the European population, about 25 million people, were based on contemporary chronicles and more general demographic analyses. However, more recent research, using more rigorous methods, such as pollen analysis, to determine the depopulation of cultivated lands, the study of thousands of property records and wills, and, crucially, the archaeological analysis of mass graves, suggests that the figure could be significantly higher. Some of these new estimates suggest that mortality in Western Europe could have reached 50%, and even more in some densely populated regions. The archaeology of mass cemeteries, such as East Smithfield in London, has provided direct evidence of the immense number of dead in a short period. These new estimates, though still subject to debate, underscore the brutality of the Black Death and the depth of its demographic impact. It is not just about numbers. It is about a reevaluation of how the plague reconfigured societies, economies, and the mindsets of survivors. The debate about mortality is not merely an academic exercise. It is an attempt to understand the true magnitude of this collective trauma and its long-term implications for the history of Western civilization. And so, as the lights begin to dim, we are left with a grim reminder: the fragility of civilization. The Black Death, an event that marked a before and after in the history of Europe, is much more than a series of dates and mortality figures. It is a story about human vulnerability, about the unpredictability of nature, and about humanity's astonishing capacity to survive, adapt, and ultimately rebuild. It teaches us that epidemics can break the chains of society, that knowledge can be useless in the face of an unknown enemy, and that faith and reason can be tested to their limits. But it also shows us the tenacity of the human spirit, the ability to find hope in despair, to adapt to new realities, and to forge a future, even from the ashes of an apocalypse. The Black Death is not just a dark tale from the past. It is a warning, an enduring lesson of our own fragility in a world where invisible enemies always lurk. It is a silent echo that resonates through the centuries, reminding us that despite all our progress, we are ultimately creatures of flesh and blood, at the mercy of forces that, at times, are beyond our control. So with that reflection, I invite you to relax even more, to let these stories settle. History is full of uncomfortable truths, and sometimes the truth is the best lullaby. Rest well.